The topic of whether or not Batman should be fantastical or grounded is a topic that has been circulating the space of comic book media, whether it's movies, television, or comics themselves, for a very long time. However, this discussion has become even more prominent in recent day with the announcement of James Gunn's DCU, in which he will be adapting his own live-action Batman separate from the vision of Matt Reeves' The Batman. And while some people disagree, I think that this is for the better, specifically because it gives us a new opportunity to see Batman truly adapted in all of his glory. And that brings me to the topic of this video, which is why Batman should always be fantastical. And I don't just mean this in a surface level light in terms of Batman just looking cool, because while that is important, and in my opinion should always be the case, there's a much deeper reason as to why Batman should always be fantastical, and in this video I'm going to explain it to you. But very quickly before we get into the video, as you can see, I am a new channel. My name is K the God. Welcome, and if you like my content, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share, and stick around because there will be a lot more content on the way. Now that we've gotten through all the hoopla, why should Batman always be fantastical? Firstly, I think Batman should always be fantastical because adding this element to his character further emphasizes how much his trauma affects him and how obsessed he is with his mission because of that trauma, which is objectively one of the biggest parts of Batman's character. If you're confused by what I mean, allow me to explain. Batman is a character who within the confines of his universe is consistently recognized as a master of all martial arts, a master of every intellectual field, and a man who's trained himself to the peak of human physical condition, which allows him to perform feats that are just straight up superhuman. And again, this isn't just with his physicality, his brain is also basically superhuman. The amount of information that Batman is able to retain and apply in the field effectively is so outrageous that it shouldn't even be conceivable. But he does it anyway. Which brings me back to my initial point. Batman being capable of doing all of these ridiculous things is a direct response to that tragic night when he was 8 years old in Crime Alley. And obviously as the audience, we know how tragic Batman's backstory is and we know how hard he pushed himself after that. But the fantastical capabilities that I just listed give us an exact quantification of how hard Batman pushes himself ever since that night. And I honestly don't think that this is something that's ever been effectively explored in any live-action Batman adaptation that we've gotten. And considering how many Batman movies we've gotten, that's honestly sad. Now, don't get it twisted. I'm not saying that we haven't gotten any good Batman films because we just objectively have. I think Batman Begins is great. I think The Batman is great. And I think The Dark Knight is great. I also really like Batman 89 and Batman Returns. And I do have some guilty pleasure with Batman Forever. And you thought I was going to say Batman and Robin? Absolutely not. That movie is horrible. But even though all of these films have really good elements of Batman in them, I can't help but get the feeling when I'm watching them that they're just missing something. And I honestly think that what those movies are missing is what I'm going over right now and what I'm going to continue to explain in this video. But even if you look at the most grounded Batman stories in comics, like Batman The Long Halloween, Batman Year One, Batman Dark Victory, stories where he's predominantly fighting mobsters. In those stories, Batman quite literally is still doing extremely fantastical shit. I mean, in Year One, when he's fresh off the plane back from his training arc, he's slicing through brick with karate chops and kicking trees in half. And then after doing so, proceeds to say he's still not ready, which again goes directly into my point of these physical capabilities of Batman tying directly into his obsession for his mission directly after the death of his parents. But it gets even worse. Not only was Batman fast enough to dodge gunfire in Year One, he was also strong enough to kick through concrete pillars. And then when we move to The Long Halloween, he straight up fist fights Solomon Grundy, a character who since his inception was tangoing with mid-tiers and high tiers like Diana and Superman, and is stated by DC themselves to not have any fluctuations in terms of his power level. And then when we get to Dark Victory, he straight up beats Solomon Grundy up. So even in stories when Batman is at his most grounded, he's still very much a fantastical character. Now, the second reason why I think Batman should always be fantastical is because when Batman's obsession is so well established and quantified via his physical capabilities or intelligence, it makes it that much easier for the audience to believe that other characters in his mythos can have similar obsessions just in different areas. And I honestly think that in comic books, when Batman writers realized this is when Batman truly became great. And I think the proof of this is in the pudding. If you look at the Golden Age, sure, you could argue that Batman had some pretty decent storylines back then, but for the most part, a lot of the campy and silly stuff that we know for Batman originates from this era. And by extension, we get things like Batman 66, which is inherently a campy and silly show. But it wasn't until the 70s and 80s when Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams came into the picture, and that whole group of writers who wrote Batman during that era, that Batman truly became great in terms of quality of story. And ironically enough, you could argue that this success stemmed from Denny O'Neil trying to ground Batman in a way. However, he didn't do it in a way that stripped Batman of the things that already made him cool. What he did was he added context and or explained why Batman is so good and why he is capable of doing the things that he's able to do. And this era was essentially our first introduction into the Batman that we know today, in which he is the master of all known fighting styles. He is a master in every field of intelligence, etc., etc. This era is also the era that made Batman dark and gritty, but still kept him entirely in the world of fantasy. And this is why we were able to get characters like Ra's al Ghul and Man-Bat, who by the way are perfect examples of what I'm talking about. If we look at Ra's al Ghul, we're talking about a character who is so obsessed with his motive of making the world a perfect place that he literally became immortal and figured out how to create the Lazarus Pits. He then went on to establish his own cult that consists of the greatest hand-to-hand fighters and assassins on Earth, and he himself has become a peak human, mastering an infinite amount of martial arts, so much so that he's mastered combat techniques lost to time. By extension, he passes this knowledge down to the rest of his cult followers, and they too have now become masters of every known martial art. And did I mention, due to prolonged exposure to the Lazarus Pits, he also just straight up has enhanced strength on a regular. And again, all of this stems from his obsession with trying to cleanse the world and make it a better place in his eyes. And because Batman is as obsessed as he is with his mission, it's much easier for us as the audience to suspend our disbelief for Ra's al Ghul. And this same thing can be applied to Kirk Langstrom Man-Bat, who was so obsessed with trying to make a scientific improvement that he turned himself into an entire bat. That also, again, has superhuman levels of strength. But now that you guys understand what I'm saying, you can literally apply the same logic to most of the characters in Batman's mythos. You could apply it to Dick Grayson because of the fact that after his parents were murdered, he vowed to stop crime the same way Batman did, which makes it more believable for him to try as hard as he did to not only become Robin, but later on Nightwing. You can apply this same logic to characters like Mr. Freeze, who obviously had an obsession with saving his wife, and Poison Ivy, who has her obsession with plant life. And the list goes on. And we know that what I'm saying, at least for this bit, is objectively true because if you look at all of the grounded adaptations of Batman that we've gotten, all of the characters that we see are watered down versions of themselves. For example, in Christopher Nolan's Batman films, we did get Ra's al Ghul, but instead of Ra's al Ghul being immortal and having the Lazarus Pits, he was just a leader of an assassin group. And while at his core he was still comic accurate to what Ra's al Ghul is, the over-the-top fantasy elements that help to make his character better aren't there because of the fact that the main character himself isn't being adapted in that light. So it's an extremely daunting task to try and make the antagonist a fantastical villain when your main character doesn't even have those qualities. And that same flaw would also follow its way to The Dark Knight Rises when they decided to adapt Bane. And while this Bane was definitely more intelligent than the one that we saw in Batman and Robin, this Bane also completely lacked his comic accurate physicality and lore. So there was no venom, there was no inhumane strength, there wasn't an extreme master of many martial arts, and overall to me it just didn't feel like a true adaptation of Bane and felt kind of like a completely different character. And this trend also affects the villains that you would consider to be more grounded in the Batman mythos, like Joker and Riddler. And in my opinion, the only reason why these performances are still pretty good is because of the fact that these are the more grounded rogues that Batman has. For example, a character like Joker doesn't really have any superpowers, so you can still pretty much adapt Joker one-to-one without changing much of his lore and mythos. However, even with Joker being grounded in relation to other Batman villains, Joker is still over the top and very comic booky in his nature, and because those elements don't fit in a grounded universe, we still end up slightly tweaking the character, which is why we ended up with an adaptation like Heath Ledger's, which admittedly was still good because it was still true to what Joker is. However, it's still not a traditional Joker. And the same thing can be said for Paul Dano's Riddler and Matt Reeves' The Batman. So in this new upcoming DCU, I think that the approach should definitely be to lean heavily into the fantasy elements of Batman, but still honor them and take them seriously. Because in older Batman adaptations that did somewhat honor the fantastical elements, they didn't honor the seriousness of these elements, and that's why people were turned off from it. But moving into arguably the most important reason as to why Batman should always be fantastical, and funnily enough, just like the first reason I gave, I feel like this reason is also often overlooked and unironically shouldn't be, because this is a very key element of Batman's character. And that reason is Batman being fantastical helps to further what he represents as a character, and that is to inspire. Now, you could obviously argue that a lot of superheroes are meant to inspire, and that even the grounded depiction of Batman still inspire. But the inspiration that Batman can have on the audience, especially young men, when he's truly adapted in all of his glory, in my opinion, gaps the inspiration that a lot of superheroes have, and that any adaptation of Batman that is grounded can even try to have. And the reason why that is because unlike characters like Superman, who are very inspirational, or characters like Spider-Man, who are also inspirational, Batman is a man at the end of the day. There was no spider bite, there was no alien physiology that gave him his abilities. His abilities were earned through sheer hard work and dedication, and his ability to turn tragedy into triumph. And Batman consistently is like the walking embodiment of the indomitable human spirit, which is something I personally believe that a lot of us can relate to, because of the fact that as men, a lot of us want to be the never say die type of man, but a lot of us don't have the courage or the willpower to become that in real life. And when we read Batman comics or watch Batman movies or media, we feel like Batman helps us feel more like that. And when you have this regular man who trained himself to no longer be a regular man go up against superhuman level threats or god tier level threats, it's inspiring to see. Because again, even though it's not real, it showcases to the viewer that even though you're a human, you can still accomplish anything that you put your mind to. And in my opinion, I feel like that's the biggest takeaway from Batman's character. And in my opinion, that's why Batman needs to be faced off against outlandish threats, because it showcases as a constant reminder that no matter the obstacles, you can overcome them if you try your hardest and put in the work necessary. And whether people realize it or not, I'm sure a lot of you guys feel the same way that I do. I'm sure a lot of us who are Batman fans can remember watching things like Batman the Animated Series and watching him encounter beings like Clayface or Man-Bat. And while we're just little kids at the time watching a show, we're scared of these villains, but watching Batman sit there and not be afraid and genuinely not be shitting bricks was always something that we found cool and inspiring and made us fall in love with the character. Because in the face of great horror or great tragedy, Batman was always able to endure and overcome. And I know it's popular today to try and bash people who like hype moments in aura and say that they're like meatheads and don't actually care for good writing. But the hype moments in aura are also there to display something deeper than just superficial elements. And I genuinely think with characters like Batman, Spider-Man, Superman, those moments are equally as important as how well they're written. And in my opinion, directly tie into how well they're written. So again, I don't think that this element of Batman should be overlooked at all. And this brings me to my final reason as to why Batman should always be fantastical. And that reason is him being fantastical helps him make sense in the world that he exists in. As we all know, Batman lives in a world full of metahumans, full of highly intelligent characters, full of god tier level characters, and just all around superpowered beings. And with that being the case, Batman himself needs ways that he can contend these characters. So that's why him being a super genius is important. That's why him being a master of all martial arts is also important, even so much so that he's mastered alien techniques to combat higher threats. And that's why him also training himself to the physical peak of his human genetics is also important. So when we now see Batman do things like contend characters in the Justice League and even one-shot characters like Wonder Woman with precise kicks, we as the audience, knowing that Batman is a master of all martial arts and pressure points, can understand that the reason why he's able to do that to Wonder Woman is not because he's as strong as Wonder Woman, but because of the fact that he's a peak human, but also he knows the precise strike to take her down regardless of her anatomy and her physical abilities. And this isn't something that's exclusive to Batman. Most human characters or street level characters have this same exact treatment. For example, we could look at Lex Luthor, a character who recently just appeared in Superman 2025, and Lex Luthor is a super genius, and because of this, his intellect is how he combats Superman. So much so that in the comics, he's even able to create armor that can help him contend Superman in a physical match. We see Batman employ his intelligence in similar ways when he creates tech to fight high-level threats as well. And even if you want to look through a more grounded lens and analyze the martial artists of the DC universe, you could look at characters like Lady Shiva, who are so good at martial arts that not only can they contend the likes of Batman, through immense practice and skill, she's able able to take her martial arts to such a level that it's essentially like having her own superpower, even though it isn't actually a superpower. And again, this isn't something that's limited to just Lady Shiva. This is like for pretty much all of the martial artists in the DC universe. So pretty much any prominent street tier character that you can think of probably has martial arts relative to this degree. Think popular fantasy martial arts movies like Ip Man or Enter the Dragon. Essentially take those movies times 10 and like what those characters are able to perform in those movies, and that's essentially what you get in DC Comics for the average martial artist. And this is why characters like Nightwing, Batman, Lady Shiva, Azrael, etc., can take on hundreds of opponents with just their hand-to-hand combat abilities alone. And in a fantastical universe, their abilities need to be at this exaggerated level because of the fact that, again, they're in a world full of gods and monsters. And if they're capable of doing crazy things like fighting hundreds of opponents, it makes the audience more willing to suspend their disbelief when you see a character like Batman holding his own with the Justice League. And this also ties into why a lot of the solo Batman adaptations don't branch out into larger universes, because once you escape that grounded world and try to enter the fantastical world of someone like Superman, the entire premise that you built your world on kind of falls apart. Meaning that if you want to branch out and make that merge a real thing, you kind of have to rebuild your character from the ground up. Which is part of the reason why I don't think Matt Reeves' The Batman should merge over into the DCU, but that's a separate video. It's also like straight up been confirmed by Matt Reeves that it's not happening, so like I don't even think I need to make that video. But you guys get the point of what I'm trying to say. But overall, those are the 4 main reasons as to why I feel as if Batman should always be fantastical. And like I said at the beginning of this video, I truly believe that the new DCU has the opportunity to check all of the boxes that fans have been wanting them to check for Batman for years. And I truly hope that they seize that opportunity. With all that being said, it's been K the God. If you guys have enjoyed my yab session, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you guys in the next video.